Welcome back to another episode of the Nuances podcast, where we talk about our Asian stories and how our cultures affect everything from our career choices to our views on anti-racism, disability justice, queer rights, and so many more. I'm your host Lazu, a new American who grew up in the only place the dodo bird ever lived, Mauritius. Today, I'm super excited for you to hear my conversation with Chef Jenny Dorsey. Jenny is a professional chef and food writer, researcher, and educator who studies food as the foundation of human meaning-making and identity formation. She holds a Master's of Education from Harvard University and is currently a Fulbright-National Geographic Fellow in Singapore, researching food security in the context of hawker centers. Jenny is an IACP-winning photographer, James Beard Awards-nominated writer, and has been named an industry game changer by Food and Wine and a trailblazing activist by the world's 50 best. In pre-pandemic 2020, she also gave a TEDx talk titled How Food Can Be a Source of Identity, Intimacy, and Vulnerability. You can find Jenny on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Her handle is Chef Jenny Dorsey on all platforms. She also has a great Substack that I recommend checking out if you're interested in learning more about the food industry, food policy, etc. And now, let's get on to our conversation with Jenny.
Hi everyone, I'm Jenny Dorsey. I'm a professional chef and author and food educator. So I work at kind of the intersection of food, politics, sociology, and a little bit of anthropology. So what I really focus on is how food informs human identity development as well as meaning making. So how we use food to understand the world around us, to be able to interact with ourselves and build relationships with other people.
That's awesome. So we'll go back a little bit. Where'd you grow up and what was that like as an Asian American?
Yeah, so I was born in Shanghai, but I moved to the States when I was 3.5. So I grew up for the first 5 years in New York in the Bronx, and then my parents moved to Seattle. So I spent the rest of my childhood years in Seattle. I went to college in Seattle as well. So a lot of formative years in Seattle. I could not wait to get out of Seattle. Sorry to all the people who love Seattle listening to this. I really not a Washington girly. So yeah, very quickly got out of that vibe and moved back to New York.
That's awesome. So what made you want to become a professional chef?
Yeah, so I mean, my whole life, I was very, very food motivated. One of the memories that my mom always likes to recount is when I was 10, we took a family holiday to Las Vegas. And I, for whatever reason, was given the option to make an itinerary for the day. I don't know if that's a great vacation move to give your 10-year-old, any sort of control over what you're doing for that day. But there I was, and I had made a plan for us to go to like 5 buffets in a row. Because, first of all, I have like no concept of money, so I don't know that these buffets cost money to go to. But also I'm like, I just want to try all these things. And I remember my mom saying, yeah, we obviously can't do that. But looking back, I think that's a good way to capture just the kind of like curious enthusiasm that I've always had around food. So after I graduated from college, I went to management consulting and absolutely hated it. So I was kind of trying to find a way to still be creative and find my own identity or like a hobby. And so I really started cooking as a hobby, as like a creative outlet. And then being a competitive person, of course, it wasn't good enough to just do it recreationally. Had to go get the diploma. Thought it would be just a little creative excursion as I go on the partner track for consulting. And I graduated culinary school 3 days before I started at business school. And I think the juxtaposition amongst many other things became really clear that I didn't really belong in the kind of corporate business world. And so I went and pursued food full time.
Nice. For many Asian immigrants, our families have worked in or owned restaurants. Like my own family, there's a few people who have restaurants, have worked in restaurants their whole life. And it's a really grueling business and not usually associated with the prestige of, say, like fine dining in France or something, So how did your family react to your choice of becoming a chef? Because I think for most Asian families, when you say you're going to be a chef, the first thing that comes to mind is like the typical Asian restaurant. And that's like a really tough thing to do. So what was your family's response?
Yeah, definitely not very happy with that decision. Now they've come around. I think they also just didn't understand that food, A, is bigger than restaurants. that restaurants are bigger than a very difficult, all restaurants are difficult to work in, but kind of like a environment where you have to be open really late and you can not charge very high prices. Not that either of those things necessarily make your life better as a restaurant worker, but ultimately they were worried about this idea of just regressing right into a working class role. And there is a lot of classism that underpins not just Asian American like group identity, but also just how we think about everything in the States. So yeah, it was a very difficult thing to communicate to my parents.
What made them come around?
I didn't talk to them for about 4 years, so I think that helped in just getting the message across that, I have boundaries, and if they want to engage with me, they have to really think through what they're willing. They have to do some work, some self-work. So I'm really proud of both my parents for doing that work. The work is ongoing, and there was definitely a lot of healing for me as well in them. And it took a really long time of watching the kind of emotional trajectory of their response as I just stopped talking to them. And I would not maybe recommend just shutting your parents out cold turkey. Not everyone can do that, but also, it was not super pleasant either. But in the end, I think having space to not feel beholden to what they wanted in terms of success, what they wanted in terms of what a good life is, and being able to go through a process that psychologists will call like individualizing, which I think for many immigrant children is a hard process to be able to undergo, because you're constantly held as the vicarious child. You're the dreams that they never got to realize, right? And so at some point, and I hit that point in my early 20s, but I see people hitting it at all these different stages of their life, is you wake up and you realize you're not sure what it is that you want, or what it is that you just feel you want, or you've been told you want, or you've been socialized to want, and being able to do some of that unraveling. And I think it's very hard to do that when you're constantly in the presence of being influenced by other people's desires.
Yeah, I resonated with your story so much because I had a very similar trajectory, although not in food, but in music. I did the whole thing. I went to engineering school. I got a job at a Silicon Valley corporation, and everyone was so proud that I worked at this big company, and I wasn't happy, and I didn't know why. And then I had to come to grips with the fact that maybe I don't really want to do this. Maybe I'm doing this for other reasons.
And have I really given myself time and space to actually think about what I want and believe that I deserve to pursue that? I think it's really hard for parents, especially immigrant parents, who most likely have a lot of unresolved traumas and haven't had any real support system or access to resources to manage through and navigate that trauma, to really be able to parse out they want you to do these things not because they just want to oppress you, but because they think that it will grant you freedom and safety and whatever, right? There's all these things that they have in their minds as this idyllic life that they've worked so hard to give you, and reconcile the fact with the more important thing is that you're happy and that you feel fulfilled, and they don't really understand what that fulfillment feels like for you or what that looks like for you, and having to embrace that unknown is challenging. I mean, it's hard to not parent.
Yeah, I think to them, because they grew up in poverty, because they grew up, struggling financially, they were finally at a place where they're like, okay, my child has a job that pays really well and she's going to be set for life. Things are going to be okay. And then I'm like, nope, I'm quitting.
What is this other thing you want?
And I had to explain to them, you should see this as progress, because I do now have the option to do something that isn't just so that I can put food on the table because I'm okay now. And they're like, oh, okay, but also, are you going to be okay? It takes a while, but I think eventually they come around. So you've written several cookbooks, including the bestseller, The Avatar Last Airbender Official Cookbook. I'm curious what the process is like for writing a cookbook. I think one of the first videos I saw from you was about writing a cookbook and just the behind the scenes. So wonder if you want to share a little bit about what it's like to write a cookbook and maybe some things that people might be surprised to know about the process.
Sure. So for those who are interested in writing cookbooks, there's different ways you can get into cookbook writing, but the two big ones, one is you're a commissioned cookbook author. So that's what I was. These publishers reached out to me asking for me to write the cookbook. So they already have the concept down. They already had, how many recipes they want, how many photos they want, the turnaround time. They are the publisher, so you don't have to sell the book to anyone, all that stuff. They have a marketing plan. I can talk a little bit about the pros and cons of that in a second, but anyway, that's just the one way of getting into the cookbook field. The other way that you often probably see more frequently is the concept-driven cookbooks that you see from a lot of chefs or bloggers or whatnot, where that person comes up with their own idea. Maybe it's the restaurant's cookbook, right? Or if you have a famous blog, then you write a succession of cookbooks, whatever. So you are taking that concept, you go to usually an agent, and then you're going to pitch it out to different publishers, and then different publishers hopefully are all interested, and it goes out to something called an auction, where they're all bidding on how much they're going to pay you for your cookbook. And during that process, you also negotiate, how long the cookbook's going to take you, how many recipes are in it, how many photos. A lot of times those publishers will have an art team, so there's more oversight on what exactly your cookbook will look like. There's a lot more people for you to liaise with. Whereas the commissioned, often it's smaller publishers, and it's something where, because everything's already set up, it's not like you have tons and tons of wiggle room on things to do and change. So I have a lot of feelings about if I would do commissioned cookbooks again. The main answer to that for me at this point in my career is probably no, but I think it was a good way to come up in the cookbook world and also be able to apply a lot of the different skills that I had, because especially when you're working on a small cookbook, you don't really have the means, you don't have the money that you're getting paid to pay a whole team. So if you're getting a really big cookbook advance, then you can hire a photographer, you can hire a prop stylist, you can hire a food stylist, you can maybe hire a video person if you have a PR team. You might have another editor, right? Or several editors, a copy editor, whatever. When you're on the commission side, most of the time you're doing all of those things. So writing the Avatar, The Last Airbender cookbook, so that is the official one, it's the one that's licensed through Nickelodeon. It was many, many layers of review, right? Because ultimately Nick also has to review it. But I had to do all the groundwork. So writing all the recipes, pitching all the recipes, so giving them the table of contents, and then also developing all the recipes, testing them, which takes a very long time, styling them, photographing them, all of that. So yeah, the process is complicated, and it is very worthwhile if it's like a baby that you really cared about. But what hurts my heart a little bit is when I talk to cookbook authors who feel like they just wanted to get some cookbook out there and they weren't really able to write the book that they wanted. They put so much energy and time into something that they don't love. And so I definitely know how that feels as well, though I think my upfront investment in some of those commissioned cookbooks I didn't care about as much, isn't as high. So anyway, long story short is just really think about how much real effort, energy, time you're putting into cookbooks before pursuing down that road, because often they don't sell super well. One of the things that publishers have probably been saying, but it's just like not super mainstream discourse, is that most books in the US don't sell very well. The average US book sale is like 500 copies, which is very low, obviously.
Wow.
You really have, especially in this day and age, you really have to have a pretty big following, or it's just like, you luck out and your book goes viral or whatever it is. But it is really, really hard even for celebrities to sell books. There was an article from the New York Times a while ago talking about this particular issue about how celebrities can't even sell their memoirs. And I remember, I think it was like Justin Timberlake's memoir only sold like 8,000 copies, right? That's very low.
I didn't even know he had one.
Yeah, me neither. / like, I don't know if I want to read that, but right. And then Billie Eilish had one that didn't sell very well. So, and these are really big stars. And obviously most people can't command that kind of social attention and whatnot. That being said, there are also people who surprise us and get tons and tons of sales. So all I'm saying is, like all media, publishing is difficult to get into. Interesting things about cookbook writing, things that people I think don't just recognize is just how much recipe testing, like how much time recipe testing takes. It takes so much time to get it right, and how difficult it is to really write recipes that are actually going to work for an array of people across so many different environments. You have no idea how people are cooking your food. You don't know what kind of ovens or pans or equipment or flour or all of these things that they're using, and to try and really write a recipe that not only they can follow, it's not too taxing or burdensome for them to do, and it's going to be consistent. It's just a lot. It's so much work, which ironically is why sometimes famous chefs, when you buy their cookbook, a lot of the recipes don't work because their recipe works perfectly in their kitchen, right? And they have that kitchen for years and years, but it doesn't work in your kitchen, right? You don't have the nice oven that they do. You don't have a blast chiller. You don't have all of these things. So it is really a difficult negotiation on how to make things that actually translate to a larger audience.
That's so interesting. So if I put my oven on 400 Fahrenheit, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the same as your oven.
Right, because your oven could be, it could run hot or cold. That's one big problem, is that ovens run hot or cold. But also your oven could be bigger or smaller than mine. Is your oven a convection? Does it heat a certain way? Does it maintain heat in a certain way? And then whatever tray or cake pan or whatever thing you're using, how it's interacting with the oven. And I'm not saying all of these are make or break, right? For the most part, our 400-degree ovens are close enough. It's fine. But I'm saying the hardest thing is that you don't know how many of these little variables are happening in every recipe. And obviously, a little change there, a little change here, ends up, everything looks very different.
It adds up. Yeah. So when you're developing a new recipe, on average, how many times are you testing it?
So it depends on how difficult the recipe is, but in a very condensed timeline. So for example, the Avatar book, I had about 3 months to write it, which is not ideal. Most cookbooks are being written over like 2 years. What I would love to do, like the ideal recipe testing process is like you develop the recipe idea, you test it out one time. Let's say it magically works that first time, which is not the case, but you test it until it actually gives you the result that you wanted, what you envisioned in your brain. And then you test it 2 to 3 more times so that you're getting a consistent result. And usually during that testing process, there's still changes that you're making, little things, little tweaks. And then the best thing possible is that you actually send it to someone else, maybe multiple other people, to test that recipe. So usually when you have more time or more money, like a team, you would send it to multiple recipe testers and they test that recipe and then they come back with all their feedback. So for some of the big food media outlets that actually have really good recipes, like New York Times or Serious Eats or America's Test Kitchen, where those recipes, they're kind of known to actually work, it's because they have a whole team of cross-testers and they are investing a lot of money and energy, right? Everybody has to get paid, everybody has to buy those ingredients so that they're constantly testing and testing and testing until everybody's actually getting the result that you want. And that process takes, I mean, if everybody's doing right on top of each other, maybe a week. If it's not, weeks on end. Not that you're only working on one recipe at a time. So that's like the best, most ideal way. And even then, there's probably going to be some slight issues with your wider readership. I'll take this moment to note that this is one of the reasons why it is so important to be working with grams in recipes, because I don't understand, like the US is like the only place that still does this, but cups and flat, like one onion, like what are we even saying here? I have no idea what size anything is. I have no idea how you scooped the thing. Everything should be in grams except for very light things, like if you have 1 teaspoon baking soda, it doesn't register because it's not a gram. So fine, you want to use a teaspoon, it's fine. But most everything should be always in grams. Restaurants are not cooking in cups because if then you would go to restaurants and nothing would ever taste normal, right? So anyway, that is a hill I constantly am dying on.
As somebody who did not grow up in the US and is constantly flustered by the recipes that I find on the internet, I completely agree.
So confusing.
Because it's so confusing. And then there's ounces and there's fluid ounces and the regular ounces. And then a cup of flour is not the same weight as a cup of sugar.
Exactly.
And nothing matches.
So that's why if you just do everything in grams, everything's fine. And also it frees up a lot of dishes. Like you don't dirty as many dishes. Most of the time people say they don't want to convert into grams because it's too difficult. And I'm like, so you would prefer to do 15 more dishes? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I've read a few of your Substack posts and I really enjoy all of your writing. You have so many perspectives that you bring to the table as a woman, as an immigrant, as a chef, as a writer, an educator, and food policy researcher. So I'm wondering if there's any particular nuanced topic that you would love to talk about that you don't often get the opportunity to.
Sure. I think especially in light of all the things that are happening right now where the world is very divided, it's an election year, people are nervous, and people are always looking for something that makes us feel good, is really cautioning against this narrative that food is this wonderful thing and it brings us together and it's like it's feel good and everything about it is really good, right? Because while there are aspects of that is very acutely true, like if you and I have a meal, it is shown, research sees that there are heightened levels of oxytocin. It's that happiness, the dopamine release in our brain. So we do really bond with people that we eat with. It's the same thing that gets released when new mothers are feeding their babies. So eating together really does help people bond. So like at an individual level, at a group level, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, yes, we should all just eat together and make friends. Yeah. That sounds really idyllic, but one of the things that I often try to get to in a lot of the things that I write about, as well as what I post about on social, is we need to look at bigger systems issues. We need to look at the systemic incentivizations that people have on pursuing certain behaviors and what happens when it goes up the chain, right? And so if you look at how food product marketing has consistently weaponized this idea of like, oh, well, food is this really lovely, bringing us together sort of marketing narrative, every time people start having more detailed conversations about how the food chain exploits people, how a lot of workers, meatpacking workers, agricultural workers are being terribly treated all along the line, how there's a lot of cultural appropriation that happens in food and who is allowed to cook what and who is willing to pay what, going back to our conversation about immigrant parents who have often had restaurants. So there's all these nuance and all these very complicated and often messy and very politically charged subjects about power, who has it and who doesn't, that kind of gets glossed over when we treat food as this thing that is essentially untouchable. We can't ever make it look bad. And many people that I talk to, including peers of mine, when I went to grad school for education, I had peers who were like, well, you're thinking about it too much. You're making it too serious. Like, it's just food, right? It's just eating. So, and this is the end goal of all of the big food that has kind of taken over our food system, is they want us to see food as like a whatever thing. They want us to not take it seriously. They want us to think about it as a secondhand sort of consideration, because then they'll never get ousted for essentially destroying so much of not only our livelihoods, but our literal bodies in the pursuit of profit for them. So yeah, I think that narrative is something that a lot of people, whenever I talk about it, there's a lot of defensiveness around it because we often can't parse out the individual versus the system. No one is blaming you at an individual level for thinking, hey, let me invite my new friends over so we can learn about each other and maybe cross some bridges of difference. No one's saying that that is bad, but at a systems level, if not all things can be solved by just breaking bread, right? There are power structures in place that people are literally getting bombed right now. That's not going to get resolved if they just like have a nice dinner together, because there are certain people who have plenty of power on a global stage that others don't. So it's kind of like just understanding where food gets often weaponized to gloss over larger social political issues.
Yeah. When did you first become aware of food being this political thing?
I think as someone who works in the food industry with any marginalized identities, I mean, I think working in the food industry kind of have marginalized identity because you work in the food industry, is that you start noticing things are just unjust around you and how often it gets told to you as that's just the way things are, right? Everything gets excused. Whether that's working in a restaurant, you're working 14 hours days, but you can't actually clock 14 hours because then you would have to get paid overtime. So you work from 9 to 2 o'clock, but then you get to clock in at 2 o'clock so that you're only getting paid for your 8 hours or whatever it is. There's all of these behaviors and practices that you start seeing in your life, or things that people will say to you. When I went to culinary school, and just the curriculum of what we're learning and what kind of food gets elevated versus what food gets ignored or dismissed. We did not touch African food at all. Like, it was like as if Africa did not exist. We never even talked about it, right? So there are, both through the process of inclusion and omission, you start noticing that there's a certain hierarchy in place. And what's so toxic about it is, I think, or less so now, but before, especially when I was coming up in the industry, like 14 years ago, right, is that it was not okay to really talk about it. And so there's like this politics of what is even allowed to be said, the politics of like silence. And one of the things that education will always tell you is the first way to oppress people is that they cannot name their oppression. They cannot talk about, they do not even have the vocabulary to describe what's happening to them. So I think you start seeing that and feeling that. And for the people who do have the privilege like me to actually say something, because I was able to say, okay, I can get a different job, right? My livelihood is not totally dependent on this job. If I speak out, if I disagree or whatever, I don't have that existential anxiety that some of my peers really do, is I should say something about this, I should do something about this. And once you actually start reading up about the food system, it is not hard to get to the point where, oh wow, food is really political. I think generally speaking, everyone can grasp that food is political at some level because we have to eat. So hunger is political. So I think that's like where most people's consciousness is at, right? Hunger is always a political thing. But what we don't realize is hunger is, first of all, it's multifaceted. It's really complicated. How do you even determine if someone is hungry? Who gets to say what is hunger? How do you measure hunger? But all of the things that go into food ultimately shape kind of our identity. How I think about myself in relation to someone else is often shaped through how we eat, what we don't eat, who we eat with, all of those things. And therefore, those acts or those omissions make our lives very political, and that contributes to the fact if I am hungry, if I'm not hungry, when I'm hungry. Right. So I feel like we very quickly start expanding the circle of what is political and what is not, and then where eventually you will end to the place where everything related to food is political, not just hunger.
Speaking of that, would you like to tell us more about Studio Atao and how you started it, and specifically maybe talk about your series Asian in America and what that was about?
Sure. So I run a nonprofit called Studio Tao, which I founded in 2018. And so we do a mix of things. We have kind of three big pillars. One is education, one is research, and one is community organizing. So our general goal is improving the kind of diversity, equity, inclusion standards for the food industry through those three pillars. So educating food workers on food systems, on the issues that they're facing within the food system. We have a curriculum that's coming up called Food Systems 101. So it's the first of its kind, like for food workers, by food workers, talking about the food system through really an explicitly social justice lens. We're not trying to be neutral. We're very clear on like there is injustice in the food system, right? Not trying to toe a party line. The second thing that we do is research into what are some of the issues that people are actually facing within the food industry. So for 2020 to 2022, we did a lot of work on food media and tokenism in food media. This just happened to coincide with Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate and all those things, but we had started that a little bit before all that shit really hit the fan. So again, we like to kind of dig into problems where a lot of people know that it's happening. A lot of people feel tokenized. A lot of food writers, especially writers of color, know exactly what that feels like, but they just didn't have the words for it. And I think that's our sweet spot, is really being able to address these issues within the industry that are kind of rampant but not talked about. And because we don't talk about it, we don't know how to fix it. We don't even know how to start talking about it so that we can discuss solutions. After that, we did a lot of work around hospitality and gentrification. So really thinking about what is the responsibility of independent restaurants in particular to, be part of a community kind of solution to resist gentrification, to know that with whatever they do, they're going to be part of this process, because gentrification is sweeping all of these big cities in the US, not just the US, but abroad as well. And so, what does that look like? What can we do? How can we form solidarity so that people who come to these places to eat feel not only welcome, but are able to keep coming back instead of getting pushed out of the neighborhood? And then for community organizing, a big kind of tenet of what we do is really recommending solutions that are worker-led, worker-based, that are from the people, so ground-up solutions, grassroots solutions, as opposed to most of what you see in the industry, which is always top-down. It's always like some executive far away who has, it's like our legislators, right? most of our legislators are not working class, but they are always making a lot of decisions that affect working class people. And we really just don't agree with that. We think, especially with the food industry, because there's such stigma around the people in the food industry being seen as not able to think for themselves or make critical decisions for themselves, is that we should be the ones, food workers should be the ones taking charge of their own futures. So we do organizing. We've been doing these hospitality town halls where we gather hospitality workers in different cities and talk about the issues that they're facing and kind of form coalitions so that they can demand the changes that they want, right? We're not telling them, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to rally around, because sometimes what I think is perhaps the most important thing, minimum wage perhaps, or whatever, that's not what the community feels they want to put their energies behind. So how do we provide the support system and the networks and whatnot for them to pursue what they feel is the thing that will, be the biggest change driver for them right now. So that is kind of the overall what we do now. Asian America was a dinner series that I had done for the first couple years of the studio, which I don't really unfortunately do them. Maybe we'll bring them back at some point, do them anymore. But it was a 6-course dinner series that I traveled around the US talking about the Asian American identity. So 6 courses of food, 3 courses of cocktails, an augmented reality and virtual reality art backdrop. So there was embedded into the meal. You're also reading poetry and hearing spoken word alongside these custom visuals in a virtual reality headset. So every single course talked about a different aspect of the Asian American identity. Talking about things like the model minority myth, of course, which is huge. The idea of white assimilation, white adjacency, of the divide between Asian men and Asian women and how complicated that is. The idea of interchangeable Asian. So no matter what kind of Asian you are, the same as all the other Asians, and kind of this like homogeneity that gets introduced when you create a term like Asian American in general. So it was a blend of people eating, but also people hopefully really getting educated about Asian American issues and being able to talk about them in a space with some people that they know and some people that they don't.
That's awesome. So you mentioned briefly, for example, the responsibility of restaurants in the social justice space when it comes to food and what responsibility do they have. And I think in another interview I listened to preparing for this interview, you mentioned that running a restaurant is really tough, especially if you wanted to run a restaurant the way that you would love to. It's almost impossible because the economics don't work out. Yep. Can you elaborate a little bit on the struggles that restaurants face and maybe if potential solutions that you are thinking about, or how are you going about trying to think of solutions?
Yeah, I talk about this often, and I feel like I always provide like a perspective of people don't want to hear, which I think going back a little bit in like history, American history, is that like for the vast majority of our time eating prepared food restaurants, that was not something that middle-class Americans had access to. It really wasn't until McDonald's that middle-class Americans could even be eating out that frequently, right? Most of the time people were still cooking at home, or maybe they weren't eating out with this kind of frequency that we see as normal these days. So if you look at the origins of the hospitality industry, which we kind of see as more like a sit-down, right, a fancier or more upscale or whatever experience, all of that is first of all rooted in slavery. And so as you can imagine, if it's rooted in slavery, then most of the people that have access to it are upper class plantation owners, people who had these enslaved people who could be inside cooking and serving them all the time. So right now we have this complicated issue where we expect restaurants to essentially feed us at the frequency of a social service, but we don't want them to charge us the prices when before they were being charged to an maybe upper middle class, upper class that actually made the system work, even though that system was also predicated on free labor. So TBD if that model ever really worked. So these two things are just not congruous with one another, is what I'm getting at. We can't say, oh, we're going to free market capitalism. Everybody should just be able to charge whatever they want, and the costs are going to be incredibly high. But at the same time, more than 50% of our population should have access to this particular thing all the time. Like, we can't have both. And so I think for a lot of restaurants these days, when they're facing incredibly high rent, growing costs of so many of their food suppliers. And one of the issues is that food supply, like in terms of raw ingredient supply, is increasingly consolidated because of big food and how agriculture is becoming increasingly consolidated. So they're also getting squeezed on every end of the cost part, and people are not willing to pay more because we have this idea that all people from middle class and up should be able to afford this thing once a week or whatever that is that like restaurants have such a little amount of room to play in, and then we're telling them they shouldn't get any support from the government because that would be socialism. So we're asking them to provide a service without giving them any of the support structures that they need, while putting constraints on a cost and revenue side, which isn't a free market either. So I feel like this is this classic American dilemma where we don't want to look at the failings of capitalism because we are ingrained and taught that socialism is the worst thing ever and capitalism will solve all of our problems, even though capitalism obviously is not working for many things, one of them being the restaurant industry, and we're stubbornly refusing to budge in either direction. Like, I feel strongly that if we want independent restaurants to continue operating in a way that's going to be more sustainable for everyone, that they're going to be paid well and they're going to have benefits and all that stuff, requires some aspect of government support and subsidies. And then everyone really doesn't like hearing that, but if you look at fast food chains, huge restaurant groups, they get government subsidies. They just get them in these nefarious little ways that we don't know about. McDonald's for a long time, they get paid for every new person that they hire because of this worker program that the federal government has. And so there's so many different ways that these bigger companies are getting government subsidized for their exploitative work, so they can continually give us cheaper and cheaper food while pushing out these independent restaurants, while at the same time we see that we don't know what's going on behind the curtain, and we look at the independent restaurants and tell them you all are lazy and you can't figure it out. Like, yeah, it's wild. So long story short, I think independent restaurants should be taken care of, like should have access to a lot more government services. And then on top of that, the National Restaurant Association, which ironically has the acronym NRA, they're terrible, and they're a restaurant industry group that doesn't represent they've never represented independent restaurants. They're representing the huge chains of the world, has been constantly actively lobbying against things that would help the restaurant industry. So what does it mean also that the people that are supposed to support you in Congress or get policies that would help you in Congress are constantly actively working against you? Yeah, so like without kind of solving those sort of disconnects, I think we're asking too much of restaurant owners, honestly, to somehow manage to do all of these things when really they're just trying to run a small business.
Yeah, for sure. It always baffles me how much America claims that it's all about capitalism, but it never was and never will be. No. I mean, protectionism that we have against China and other countries that we don't like, and there's so many ways that we do not allow the free market to do what supposedly the free market would do, but
right.
We are very selective about when we apply that or not.
Yeah, I mean, if we are all free market, then why do we even have Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, all of that stuff, minimum wage, like all of it should be gone, right? And we obviously know that that's not how a society should work. And during COVID, when people were getting stimulus checks, like it was huge. It was so helpful for folks, and yet we will look at tangible results and say no because of this kind of ideological struggle that honestly the far right unfortunately has been able to brainwash so many of us into believing that if we struggle and if we have any sort of issues, it's our own fault. But at the same time, it's okay to bail out huge industries that honestly fucked it up themselves.
Yep, not what free market is supposed to do. And tariffs and taxes. I mean, I would be fine paying more taxes if I got health care.
Right. It's very difficult to hear from folks like, oh, well, I don't want to pay more taxes. And it's like, well, if your taxes were, right now you're already paying taxes and we don't really get a lot for it. What sort of services are you getting for your taxes versus if you paid more taxes and actually received social benefits? And why are we so against people receiving social safety nets? if anyone ever talks about like universal basic income in the States, people just jump all over them. They're so like, oh, they'll get people to be so lazy, blah, blah, right? And all the little experiments of UBI have always worked out quite well, but we just refuse. I guess the constant conversation around it is always, well, we can't take that risk in this experiment of UBI or more social safety nets in the US. And I'm like, what are we doing right now? Are we not experimenting with capitalism? We've decided we're all in on this capitalism experiment, but everything else, we can't experiment, we can't try, right? It's like, there's a lot of this ideological cognitive dissonance.
We've been running the same failed experiment
for a long time, and we refuse to really try anything else. And there's a lot of reasons why that is politically and all that stuff, but yeah, it's kind of disheartening to see the conversations online because it feels like we as in the American media and also the people who read the media and are influenced by the media are not really doing a lot of the critical reflection that's needed of thinking about other perspectives.
When thinking about sustainability and avoiding gentrifying neighborhoods when restaurants are opening, stuff like that, have you found any models that you've seen that look promising in terms of being sustainable and involving the community? Like, are there any examples that you really like?
Yeah, so we have a whole toolkit about this on the studio website that I can send you, and we list out a lot of different examples from people who are really doing the work and have been trying different things. I'll shout out Reams over in Oakland. She's been doing a lot of really incredible things for her community and is also moving into a worker-owned sort of scenario. So I do think that is really meaningful, making sure that as a owner, for whatever circumstances life has been giving you the opportunity to be an owner, that you are sharing that opportunity with others. So you're not just, employing people as a wage laborer, you're giving people a means to own something and hopefully build their generational wealth so that they can change their socioeconomic futures and things like that. So I think, being able to think ahead like that is huge. So worker co-ops definitely a big thing. One of the other things that Reams does that we also highlighted in the toolkit is really thinking about what it means for the restaurant to be a safe space for that community. So for example, one of the things that they do is that they won't serve any police officers that are in uniform. So if you come without your uniform, they'll serve you, but if you're in uniform, they'll ask you to leave because they are very we might have undocumented folks that are here. We have Black and brown folks who are constantly getting harassed by police. We have boundaries for this space, and we really do want everyone to feel welcome partaking in a meal or just meeting with people here. Reem used to be a labor organizer, so all of this makes a lot of sense in that context. And I think just the kind of deliberate thoughtfulness and intentionality that was built into creating her employee handbook, making sure that not only people are aware that they can ask the police officer to leave, or that if they don't feel comfortable, they can ask someone else for help. They have all of those things already listed and all these procedures and protocols, but also a program where people are shifting around and getting a lot of different on-the-job experience so that even if they don't work at Reams forever, that they can go and they have really marketable skills to continue a career in the food industry, and that being a career as opposed to getting stuck in one part of the industry. So I think there's a lot of really thoughtful and intentional things that owners can do, even if it's just within their small circle of influence. That still makes a big deal.
Yeah, that's awesome. Something that I would not have thought about, like the uniform, that makes sense.
Right. What does it mean to really have a space that is for the people of that community, which is a predominantly Black and brown community, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're currently in Singapore. You are a Fulbright Research Scholar and National Geographic Explorer. So do you want to tell us more about what you're doing in Singapore?
Sure. So I'm shifted my focus a little bit. My original focus was looking at state intervention on food security, specifically through hawker centers. The main focus was supposed to be hawker centers. And when I got here, I very quickly learned that, interestingly enough, a lot of food insecure people, a lot of food insecure populations in Singapore are not relying on hawker centers because it's still too expensive for them. So you have very low income folks who are not at all patronizing hawker centers because they cannot afford, $3 to $5 per meal per person. They have a budget of $12 for 2 people for the week or something. It's like completely astronomically like different worlds. So that is in and of itself a very interesting research project, but I can't do it right now. So I've shifted my focus to really look at just hawker centers and what the impact of the government interventions in them look like and how they have affected livelihoods of the hawkers themselves, how that has kind of dovetailed with the government construction of a Singaporean identity, what it also sells as Singaporean identity to attract tourism, to attract global investment, all of that stuff. Hawker centers here in Singapore are just a really interesting food vehicle that I've never seen another government focus on in this particular way, because there are obviously street food vendors, there's obviously hawker centers in other parts of the world, but the amount of like calculated intentional thought that the government has put into first housing everyone. So everyone used to be hawkers on the street, now they're in a center, there's tons and tons of them, they built so many. At first there was subsidized rentals, and that kind of changed over time, dictating, maybe not dictating, but strongly suggesting what the pricing should look like, kind of the makeup and the composition of the foods. All of that, anyway, has been fascinating in terms of history. And now as you look at hawker centers in the context of today's Singapore, where it is incredibly inexpensive to live there, hawkers are really doing a social service for us when they're selling me lunch for $3.50, right, in a place like Singapore, which just got named the most expensive city in the world. And one of the things that the government consistently points to in terms of, the cost of living in Singapore is reasonable, is that they point to the hawker centers being inexpensive. People can go eat there, it's this multicultural thing, intergenerational thing, etc. And whether that's going to be true for the next 10, 20 years, TBD, because all of these hawkers, the median age is 60, 59, whatever that is, most people are retiring, people don't want to take over, because similar to the restaurant industry and a lot of the second, third gen Americans that are not taking over, it's grueling work, and you have this kind of unofficial price ceiling that's constantly set for you by both the public as well as the government. And there's a whole reason for that. There was government feeding programs back in the 80s where people got used to this idea of how much food should cost, and that is kind of carried over. So people are not really willing to pay more at the hawker stalls, and yet things are getting more and more expensive for hawkers. A lot of hawkers don't have access to subsidized rent anymore. You have a tiny stall, so you can only have maybe 1 or 2 people working there all the time, so there's no efficiencies, there's no economies of scale. They don't have access to a lot of some of the subsidized things that a larger commissary kitchen or a franchise kitchen might have access to. So et cetera. Like, there's all these policies that sometimes are I wouldn't say that they are cannibalizing each other, but they are slightly at odds with one another in terms of what the government wants versus the actual impact, in my opinion. So that's kind of what I'm looking into, is like, what is the efficacy of some of these policies and what might be some of the impacts in the long run.
So is the idea that you're going to study that and then use that to inform food policy suggestions in the US as well, or?
Right now, I want to definitely write something that I can offer for hawker centers here, and then hopefully at some point, well, TBD on the election, because food policy, I think if Trump gets elected, we're going to have so many other things to worry about with food policy that I don't know if this is going to be at all relevant. But if we actually get to a point where we can talk about food policies in the US in a more open way, open to social safety nets, what I mean, then perhaps this could be relevant. I think that there's plenty of infrastructure available for the US government to do something like this. There's tons of food halls, right? There's tons of street vendors already. We have the parts of, if we wanted to utilize this structure, it's more about like execution beyond some of the bigger cities, and really just like a public perception willingness sort of thing. When hawker centers first started, less so now, but they had a lot of government backing. There was a lot of government oversight. There was a lot of government time spent on that. And if you know anything about kind of the food oversight in the US federal government, it is very lacking, right? We have the FDA, we have the USDA, they don't really get along all the time. And like, there's also all these there's like 20 different agencies that touch food in some way, so none of them are really talking to each other. It's so scattered, it's so confusing, and then on top of that you have the big food lobby. So it's just very difficult, I think, or it will be very difficult to get a sort of prepared food accessible for the common people, middle class people really, out there, because that's directly against the interest of mega agribusinesses as well as processed food companies, because they'd rather you eat a Snickers bar when you're hungry, right?
Yeah. What are you looking forward to in the next few years?
Yeah, well, TBD if I'll stay in Singapore right now. Just seeing on the election, it's been a little bit like, oh, maybe I should stay here. But I'm working on a book proposal, as I mentioned, so hopefully that goes out to auction in the summer and gets a publisher. So then I would be full-time working on that probably for the next 2 years, and then towards the end of that, we'll be applying for a PhD program. So more food, politics, education, writing, and research for the future.
Awesome. Well, before I let you go, I usually have a rapid fire question section. These are one word or one phrase answers. You do not have to explain, but you can if you want to.
Okay, sounds good.
What is a pet peeve you have as a chef?
Oh, people not using grams.
Recipe that you're most proud of?
Since we were talking about Atla, or Avatar The Last Airbender, the cabbage cookies in there are pretty fire.
What's an Asian food that you should like but don't?
I don't love natto. Not my favorite. I love stinky tofu. I thought I would really like. I don't like natto. But it's like really healthy. I'm gonna work on it.
What's an Asian food you'll never get tired of?
Oh, so many things. Probably pho. I can eat that every day.
What is the nicest or funniest book review you've gotten? First thing that comes to mind.
Oh my God, the funniest book review is a very negative one. It was someone on Amazon complaining that there was a recipe for stock in one of the books, and in the Avatar book. They were like, can you imagine? Can you comprehend? This person has no idea what they're doing. In this recipe for stock, it called for 1.5 gallons of water, which if you can convert in your head, 1.5 gallons is about 6 quarts, which is the size of an average stock pot. So it's very normal amount of water to put in a recipe for soup, basically. Anyway, so I don't really understand that, but I remember reading it because it was an early review, and it was it was 1 or 2 stars, and that was the complaint. It was kind of funny.
Going back to our pet peeve about units, I learned that American gallon is not the same as the UK gallon.
Oh, really? Oh gosh, I didn't even know that.
Because when I was growing up, a gallon was 5 liters. I think it's about 5 liters. So that may be why the person was upset, because the other gallon is a lot more liquid than the American gallon.
Oh, that's so funny. I mean, could be, right? It is an American cookbook, though. But, I mean, maybe this is why everything should have been in, kilograms, right? But I digress.
We are in agreement there. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. Really appreciated talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Here are my takeaways for this episode. Number 1, solutions need to come from the people who are demanding them. The food industry currently exploits people from farm workers to meat packers and restaurant workers, and independent restaurant owners are often not represented by the organizations like the National Restaurant Association, which caters mostly to the big names in the industry. Jenny stresses that it's important for organizers to listen to the people on the ground rather than dictating what they think they should be advocating for. Number 2, food is often marketed as this escapist space where everything is happy and everybody gets along. But the industry, like many others, is an oppressive system where the big players often squeeze out the smaller independent businesses while also exploiting their workers for ever-increasing profit margins. Food is always political. Number 3, most books don't sell very well, so it's something to keep in mind if you want to invest the time and energy in writing one. Number 4, the US has many of the pieces that could be leveraged for a more equitable future, whether it's the food industry or universal basic income, but we apparently do not have the political will to do so, and we have been brainwashed to never question capitalism. Number 5, aligning our business practices with our values can have significant positive impact within our own spheres of influence. Restaurants like Reams, for example, that are giving their employees a chance to be part owners by being a co-op and are also making their space welcoming to the community by ensuring that police officers are not there in uniform when they dine, are steps in the right direction and small steps that we can all take in our own businesses. If you're a business owner, you have the power to make those changes in your own business and in your own community. Number 6, immigrant parents often struggle with their kids choosing a career that isn't seen as moving up in the world. And while their fears about financial stability are understandable, there is an element of classism there that needs to be acknowledged and worked on. Again, our best influence is within our own circles, and that starts at home. Number 7, recipes using grams are much easier to replicate accurately. Using cups and arbitrary units like 1 onion can lead to very inconsistent results. And also, US gallon is not the same as the imperial gallon. The imperial gallon is about 20% more than the US gallon and is actually 4.5 liters, not 5, as I said in the interview. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jenny Dorsey. As always, links mentioned, takeaways, all that good stuff is mentioned in the show notes at nuancespot.com. If you'd like to get in touch with Jenny, there's links to her socials, her website. I will also be posting a video of our conversation in the show notes, as well as a link to Jenny's TEDx talk if you want to watch that. Next time, we will be talking to Dr. Sophia Yen about women's health and all those taboo subjects like menopause, periods, and how you don't actually have to have periods if you don't want to. Once again, my name is Lazu, and I'll see you next time for another nuanced conversation. Here's my latest single. It's called Bloom Without Me. You can find it on all the stores and streaming platforms. Look for Lazu, Bloom Without Me.
Like summer flowers wither in the fall, shedding seeds for another season. I know this is where we have to fall apart, so we can be whole again. Turns out when we grow into ourselves, sometimes we grow apart. Wish I knew how to fix it, how to tell. It's a little late for that now. Don't know how to be without you. We'll bloom again someday, someplace where all our mistakes have made us wiser. We'll bloom, so bloom without me. I never thought I'd be the one causing you pain. Loved you more than I knew I could. You know, it kills me to let you go, but it'd kill me more to hold you back. I'll never be the same without you, but we'll bloom again someday, someplace where all our mistakes have made us wiser. We'll bloom, so bloom so blue without